Welcome, friends, and thank you for joining me for another evening of global capitalism. Tonight, we're going to be talking about what is really a fundamental historical change. It's been going on for a while, although many have tried to avoid facing it. And there's now enough evidence for me to feel that we can and need to talk about it. It's the decline of one empire and the rise of another, something that has happened often in the history of the human race, but then again, it has always been momentous. And I think we're in that process now. The empire and the system on the decline, led by the US, Western Europe, and so on. And the system emerging and becoming the new global empire is centered around the People's Republic of China. And I want to devote the entirety of our conversation this evening to the signs of this, to the implications of this, and to what it portends, both in the immediate and the longer range of the future that we will be living through. Before beginning, let me quickly remind you that global capitalism is produced by Democracy at Work, a small non-profit funded media company that is now celebrating our 10th anniversary, producing critical system analysis and visions of a more equitable and democratic world coming up. If you find these lectures useful in any way, we ask that you partner with us, join with us, share them, spread them, show them to family, friends, co-workers, people you think are concerned like you, to see and think about the issues we raise and that the mainstream media shies away from, to be as polite as I can. If you want to help us continue this kind of work, please know that we will be enormously grateful and that there are a variety of ways of doing that. You simply go to our website, democracyatwork.info, to find out all about that. So let me turn then to our topic for today. I'm going to begin with a very famous observation made by Karl Marx. Marx said, and I would like you to keep this in the back of your mind as we go through the material today. Karl Marx once said that no system disappears, comes to the end of its period of life on this earth, until it has explored each and every way to continue, not to pass away, not to die. And I think that what we are experiencing is our economic system, capitalism, and that's the one Marx had in mind, and the one he spent most of his life analyzing. Our system is coming to the end of one way of being, but has found another, and so it's not about to pass away, at least not quite yet. I'll come back to that thought later. First, let's begin by sort of examining the last 100 years before the modern transition between the United States and China really got underway. Roughly 1860, roughly to 1970, 100 years more or less, was a fantastic period of time for the United States and for the capitalism in its particular form here. Rising GDP, rising income, rising wages, rising wealth, rising powerful country, eventually becoming global in its scope, eventually replacing the empire of which it had once been a small, inconsequential part, the British Empire. It was a really good ride up in which masses of people from very poor parts of the world, particularly in Europe, came to the United States hoping to find a way to make a better life. And they found it. It was built on the backs of the extermination of the indigenous people and the subjugation of, let's call them what they were, slaves brought from Africa, indentured workers brought from all over the world. As usual, the success had its flip side, the failures, the suffering that paid for it. But for most people who came to the United States, and certainly most white ones, it was a roaring good time. By contrast, the 100 years from, say, 1850 to 1950 were a period in which China, well, let's use their own phrase. They look back on this period as, ready, the 100 years of humiliation. That's a well-known phrase in China, for the 100 years. So the United States soaring up, the Chinese suffering levels of misery, poverty, child death, illness, you name it. If you ever want to get a feeling of an American who went there as a missionary and wrote a book, Pearl Buck, The Good Earth, will tell you more than you really want to understand. So you have enormous contrast between these two. Desperation on the one hand, and euphoric economic progress and wealth on the other. And as has happened so often in history, that extreme was the hint, not that anyone got it, that the reverse might be the future. And that is what I believe is going on. So let me get right to it. I want to talk to you about the signs of decline in the United States and compare them to the signs of a rising system in the People's Republic of China. And please, before I begin, don't misunderstand me. I'm looking for signs of decline and signs of rise. I'm not commenting on the goodness or the badness or the strengths or the weaknesses, which both of these have. They're different, but they both have them. One is not bad and the other one good either way. And that may frustrate some of you who need to organize your thoughts in that manner, but I don't, and these lectures won't either. Okay, signs of decline in the United States. The last several wars that this country has fought, it has basically lost. Whether it's Vietnam, or Afghanistan, or Iraq, or Libya, when you look at what the goals seem to have been by making the decision to go to war, and remember for the United States, it was a war in each of these cases many thousands of miles away, which means the war is more difficult, more expensive, and so on. This is remarkable. And even though the United States tries very hard not to see the accumulation of losses, the lesson is not lost on anybody else. And Americans, if for no other reason, have to think about it for that reason. This year marks another turning point. It's the first year, and I believe this is true forever in history, that life expectancy in the United States is lower than life expectancy in the People's Republic of China. It's been declining here in the United States for a few years. It's been rising, mostly, over recent decades in the People's Republic of China. It's just one sign among many, but it is one sign among many that point in the same direction. How come a rich country like this, at the peak of its 100 years of explosive development, or at least near that peak, should be shortening the lives of its people on average? Here's another one. The disastrous, and there's no polite way of saying this, the disastrously failed response to COVID-19. As I have said before, but needs to be said again, the United States, as one of the richest countries in the world, with one of the most highly developed medical systems, at least highly developed in the technology, the research, and so on, that is devoted to dealing with disease and injury, proves itself to be mediocre, and I'm being kind, when it comes to dealing with a threatening virus. Even though back in 1918, we did that. We tried to deal with a threatening virus. We didn't do very well then, but we had the excuse we were early in the uptick and the uprise of the American capitalist system and its empire. Now we are in the full benefit of the wealth and the economic and the medical achievements of a century. And yet, over 1 million people lost, died, and millions with what's called long COVID, whose costs in health, in life, in wealth, we can't even imagine yet with any kind of certainty beyond knowing it will be enormous. That's a sign. Here's another. For 40 years now, our leaders, Republican and Democrat and Independent, have been bemoaning the fact that inequality, economic inequality, is too great in the United States. It's not what it should be. There's too big a gap between the rich and the poor. Bemoaning it for 40 years and unable to stop it from getting worse year after year, and I include right now, right here, as I'm speaking to you. What I want you to think about is not just that it's unequal, but that the inequality deteriorates, gets worse, even as speech about it keeps repeating what a great concern it is. If it's a great concern, and I'm mindful of Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, who makes sure to say it every few months, if it's a matter of great concern to the highest levels of power and wealth in the country, and yet it gets worse, it means the system is out of control. It's a definite sign of a system that may be able to recognize its problems, but does not seem able to get a handle on solving them. Then there's the Ukraine issue. Wow. Here's something strange. In a faraway country that most Americans know nothing about and couldn't find on a map if they were asked to, tens of billions of dollars routinely not spent on all manner of urgent social needs in the United States, including the needs of the poor people because our inequality is so extreme. That money instead is pouring weapons into Ukraine. What is this about? Why are you choosing to do this? Are there some principles involved? Yes, but there are the principles involved all over the place in the world where the United States is not engaged and not about to. So we'll have to come back, and we will, to this Ukraine issue. Then I want to look at the United States in terms of how it has treated its working class. Now I return briefly to this inequality that's been getting worse. And you might call it an inequality between the employers and their top officials, 5% of our people maybe, and the mass of us, the employees, the overwhelming majority. If you distinguish employers and their assistants on the one hand, and the employees on the other, not only have the inequality between them in income and wealth gotten worse. But we have really attacked the working class of the United States, not just by making the gap between their situation and that of everybody else wider, but let me go through with you what that means, and I only have a few minutes, so we can only scratch the surface. Well, one thing it means is that slowly and steadily, the standard of living, the quality of life of working class people is being diminished. And this is very painful for a population that was told in the 100-year rise that there was such a thing as an American dream. And if they worked hard and saved their money, they would achieve it. They would have a home for themselves, an automobile for themselves, vacation for themselves, college education for their children, and all the rest that went into this fantasy. What have we given them instead? 40 years of steadily widening inequality. And then in the last 4 years, a level of additional pain and suffering, which, coming after 30 to 40 years of rising inequality, really is coming up to too much. And I'm going to make that point in another way in 2 minutes. Let's see what the last few years have visited on the American working class. First, the second worst crash in American capitalism, second only to the Great Depression of the 1930s. In the years 2020 and 2021, over half the American labor force experienced unemployment. Let me do that again. More than half the people were without jobs and income, some for only a few weeks, others for the entire time, and still are. That's a staggering blow to people. Unemployment does a number on your head, on your sense of self, on your self-esteem, on your ability to move up in the world, in your job. It uses up savings if you have any. It worsens your debts when you have to turn to them, all of which happened here in huge numbers to tens of millions of our working class. But at the same time that we hit them with the second worst depression of our capitalism, they were hit by the pandemic and the remarkably poor quality of the American response to dealing with it. So they lost grandparents, relatives, neighbors, and so on. A tremendous blow, either such a public health disaster or such an economic crash, and to have them both at the same time, at the end of 30 plus years of economic inequality worsening, that's a lot to put a working class through. But I'm not done. Before the pandemic is over, before the effects of the crash are behind us, we are already suffering yet another body blow to the working class. It's called inflation. We have a terrible inflation, currently running, depending on how you do the calculations, somewhere between 8 and 10% per year on average, we are told. The average increase in wages paid to employees runs around half of that. 4.5% to 5.5%. In other words, if you're lucky enough to have gotten a 4 or 5% increase, which most workers have not, but even if you did, you're still falling up behind at the galloping rate of 4 or 5% per year. And what is the government of this country proposing to the working class? It has put through inequality, crash, pandemic, and inflation. It's proposing to raise interest rates, going up as I'm speaking to you, knowing that that will be a special burden on an extremely indebted working class that will now have to pay more if it wants to buy a home on a mortgage, more if it wants to buy an automobile paying out over time. more if it wants to have an education for its children and has to borrow to pay the cost. And lest anyone be unclear, let me give you an idea of the grotesque injustice being visited upon the working class in an area I know especially well, since I've been a professor all my life, working in the university and college system. Let's be sure everybody understands what it means to run your educational system the way we do. This is another, all by itself, sign of system decline. The future of this country, as every economist I know, left-winger, right-winger, or in the middle, would agree, the future of this economy depends on the quality and the quantity of people coming out of our colleges and universities as much or more than it depends on anything else. That's an area where you do not save money by not spending. You're shooting yourself in the foot for your own country's future, yet that's exactly what we are doing. The cost of higher education has gone crazy. It's forcing many millions of Americans to say to themselves either, I can't afford and I won't go to college or university because I can't load up on that debt, and that's terrible for the economy. Or they load up on the debt to get the degree, and guess what? That's terrible for the economy too. And let me explain in case you're not clear. I want you with me to imagine two people sitting side by side in a college classroom. They're listening to the same professor. They're taking the same notes. They're developing their own understanding side by side. One of them comes from a comfortable, wealthy family. And the $50,000, just for round numbers, that all of this costs was the occasion for mother or father of the family to write a check for the $50,000, end of story. But you, sitting next to that person, your family hasn't got that kind of money, at least not available for that purpose, knowing that there are 4 years in an undergraduate degree, so we're talking about vast amounts of money. So you borrowed money, which you're going to pay back, as most student loans are paid back, over years, 5, 10, 12, 15, 20. And you all know what I'm about to say. When you pay off a debt, in this case $50,000 for that year of college, over many years, you have to pay not just the $50,000 it costs, but all the interest added up to that. So it isn't that that year is $50,000. It's $50,000 for the rich person. But the exact same education from the same teacher in the same room with the same curriculum that cost rich people $50 is going to cost you, who have to borrow, $60 or $70 or more. In other words, the way education works, when you have, as we do, 44 million people currently carrying student debt, is you are making the less wealthy pay more for the same education that rich people pay less for. A society that does that will not long survive. At least not if it's a society that preaches to its people concepts like equal opportunity or meritocracy or anything else. These are signs of decline. You cannot treat a working class this way. And if you do, as the United States has been doing, and there are very similar stories to tell about Europe and other places that are likewise declining. If you do that, you will provoke bitterness, rage, envy, regret, resistance, and a whole lot of other scary things among your people. You will see political divides, racial divides, gender divides, all of the divisions with their bitternesses and their extremists that are on display every day in the United States, if you're just willing to see. Let me close and make the transition to how different it all looks in China. I'll close with inflation. I'm an economist. I study inflations, among other things. And I'm amazed as I hear pundit after pundit on radio, television, newspapers everywhere, talking about the inflation in the United States and making the passing remark as if to comfort us. Well, yes, we have a bad inflation, yes, but inflation is not just here. It's everywhere. Well, let me make a transition. You know what that kind of make-believe teaches us? That there's a system going down. Inflations are not everywhere like they are here. Inflation in the United States, as I said, 8 to 10%. In Britain and in much of Europe, it's already over 10%. What's the inflation today in the People's Republic of China, as I'm speaking to you? It's what it was more or less last year. And that was what more or less it was the year before. You ready? 2.5%. Yeah. 2.5%. Inflation isn't everywhere. And you know what it means if prices are rising in the United States real fast and not at all or barely at all in China? It means more and more of the people of the world will be switching away from the higher prices that American goods cost and buying the Chinese goods, etc., that haven't gone up in price anywhere nearly so much. These are a list. It's a short list, but it's already overwhelming in what it implies. So let me turn next to the People's Republic of China. Let's begin with a simple statistic that I would like all of you never to forget as you assess whether we are at one of those great historical transition points when one empire is passing away and another one is emerging. For the last 35 years, the annual increase in the GDP, and let me remind everyone, gross domestic product, a rough measure of the quantity of goods and services being produced in a country, because every country has its GDP numbers, in a year. That's all it is, sort of a measure of size, allowing us to compare countries. Over the last 35 years, the average increase in the GDP of the United States has been about 2.5%. Sometimes more, sometimes less, but the average is about 2.5%. Over the exact same years, the growth in the GDP of the People's Republic of China has been between 6 and 9%. The People's Republic of China has developed an economic system able consistently over many, many years to grow 3 times faster than that of the United States. You know what that means? It means that the relationships between them are going to change dramatically. The country growing quickly will catch up to and surpass the one growing slowly, especially if over those 35 years, every effort was made to go faster in the United States and to make life difficult for the Chinese to go as fast as they were going. Despite all of that, the numbers I gave you are correct. Let me give you another number. Over the last generation, the average real wage, that's the wages workers get on average, adjusted for the prices they have to pay. Obviously, if you get 10% more of wages, but everything you buy costs 10% more, you're not ahead. So the real wage takes that into account. Real wages in the United States over the last 30 years, more or less, have grown, if you average it out, 0.5% a year. In many years, didn't grow at all. In a number of years, fell. In a number of years, it grew, although never quickly. Over the same period, 30 years more or less, in the People's Republic of China, the average real wage quadrupled. In the United States, the real wage now is only a few percentage points higher than it was at the end of the 1970s. In China, it's 4 times what it was in the 1970s. There is no comparison here. And it will tell you something about the feeling of the people of China for their government and their system. You really want to be an American telling them they ought to change their system? Think about it. Think what you're asking. Think how that's heard. Perhaps the most distinguishing, remarkable thing about Chinese economic growth has been their ability to compete on the highest level of technology. Chinese companies are the real competitors of Apple or Google or any of the other high-tech entities in the United States. The Europeans aren't the major competitors. The Japanese are not the major competitors. The Chinese are, across the board, whether it's electric cars or artificial intelligence. What an amazing achievement. Let me go quickly now. Poverty is worse in the United States than it's been in some years. The People's Republic of China celebrated recently lifting 800 million of its people out of poverty. They've done a good job in that area. The United Nations documents it in detail. Ukraine, told you I'd come back. China's not involved. China watches. It watches the Russians, it watches the Ukrainians, and it watches the United States and Western Europe. It's not using its resources. It's not sacrificing its people. It's not spending a lot of money. It's going about its business, which is to grow richer and to grow more productive. It's watching. That's a sign that should not be missed by anyone. And then there's that inflation number. Well, I gave you that already, so let me jump to the COVID story. This country, People's Republic of China, is still a relatively poor country relative to the United States. And yet, it has 2 things that are amazing about its COVID response. The first is that it's where the COVID disease seems to have begun, and it has 1.4 or more billion people population, 4 times the people at risk of COVID than the United States. But the response in China was remarkable. First of all, they didn't have 1 million people die. They had about 20,000 people die, a tiny fraction of what died in the United States. They saved lives. You know how they did it? By locking down entire cities, entire regions. And when they did, the press in the United States said, whoa, they're sacrificing their economic growth. Well, I told you what their economic growth was. They're so much faster than anybody else that even when they responded to COVID in the life-saving way that they did, they still maintain their average. American GDP is growing, as I speak to you, maybe 1.5%, 2% this year, if they're lucky. Chinese are double that, with their shutdowns. Is remarkable, but these are all signs. Here's another family of signs. Which of these 2 empires is menacing which? You notice where the areas of difficulty in the world are right now? If you read the press, Ukraine, obviously. Hong Kong, until recently, a big hot spot. The South China Sea, where the American Navy is conducting operations, where the Chinese Navy also is. You notice where the trouble spots are? They're very, very far from the United States, and they're very, very much closer to the People's Republic of China. Who's menacing whom? Here's a little history you might want to think about to help focus you on the point we're making today. Once upon a time, the United States was a poor colony of the British Empire. Eventually, the poor country was able to get on a roll to produce things the world wanted. From the South, cotton, thanks to the slave labor of the Africans brought here. Shipping, which those in the Northeast were able to become pretty good at. They began to challenge the British Empire, which didn't let them develop their wealth, develop their economy. And eventually it led to war. The Revolutionary War, we call it in the United States, 1775-6, around then. And the British thought they could stop their colony from emerging out of poverty and backwardness and becoming its own economically growing entity. They thought they could stop it by military action, and they went to war and they lost. And the United States declared its independence from the British Empire. A few years later, in 1812, the British tried again to squash the United States militarily, and they lost again. They even debated in England in the 1860s whether to side with the South or the North in the Great Civil War of the United States. They eventually went with the North because they could see which way the economic and political wind was blowing. They began to do what I'm asking you to do, to stop thinking you could control the flow of history and figure out you better come to terms with it, or you're going to be in deep, deep trouble. And so the British became allies with the United States. They swallowed their pride. They watched as the United States grew much faster than they did, eventually surpassing Great Britain, to the point where today, if we're honest, the positions have been reversed. The powerful Britain and the lowly colony in North America is now become the powerful American empire, and it's sometimes referred to as Poodle Great Britain. But the lesson it teaches is that trying to stop this process of transition, when one empire and system is going down, the British, and another empire and system is coming up, the American, trying to stop that with warfare and aggression and in military ways, unwise, unlikely to prevail. These historic shifts are much deeper and more powerful than any military, even ones that imagine themselves to be global in what they can do. I want to remind you again that the United States is a nuclear power, but so are the Chinese. The United States has 330 million people. The Chinese have 4 times that. Do you really want to go to war? Ukraine is important here, not in the ways you might imagine, not about the battlefield that is destroying the people and the land of Ukraine, the tragedy that obviously is. No, here's what I want you to see. The United States went in around the principle, they said, that big, powerful countries should not be allowed to invade much smaller, much poorer countries. Good principle. Most people in the world would support it. And they appealed to the world, therefore, to support the United States, the United Kingdom, Western Europe, Japan, who lined up with and behind the United States. The People's Republic of China is allied with Russia. So the two of them together appealed to the world as well, saying that the American version of what happened there wasn't correct, and they gave an alternative version, having to do mostly with NATO expanding right to the borders of Russia and threatening Russia and all the rest. I'm not here interested in the value of each of these arguments. But here's what I want everyone to understand. In the effort to speak to the many countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the overwhelming bulk of whom are poor, relatively small countries who ought to line up real quick behind the principle that big, rich countries should not invade them, didn't do that. In case you're not aware, the vast bulk of African, Asian, and Latin American countries are continuing their trade with Russia, with China, refusing to line up behind the United States. And that ought to be a sign, if nothing else I've told you is sufficient, that the wind is changing, the climate is changing.